The Bracero program, the exploitation of farm workers that changed two nations. The year is 1942, and World War II is ravaging the globe. But the war isn't just present on the battlefield. Farmers throughout the United States are leaving their fields in favor of the defense industry in the hopes for higher wages. Within a year of the start of the war, there develops a shortage in agricultural workers and food supplies across the country. The government begins to ration staple foods, and individuals are issued ration books for purchasing specific types of food each month. Still, prices are skyrocketing, and U.S. labor studies conducted in May of 1942 find that over 1 million rural workers have moved to military and factory jobs. Searching for a more diplomatically stable solution, the U.S. turns to Mexico. And on August 4th of 1942, the official agreement for the Bracero program is signed. Lasting from 1942 to 1964, the Bracero program saw over 4.5 million Mexican men imported to the United States to work in agriculture, performing backbreaking labor while often suffering from abuse and unfulfilled promises by the U.S., despite numerous diplomatic agreements between America and Mexico regarding their fair treatment and well-being. With its justification highly debated throughout history, the program preserved agriculture in the U.S. while providing jobs to the impoverished in Mexico, but diminished wages among farm workers and created a lasting dependency on foreign labor that still exists in America today. In 1942, the U.S. Department of State was asked to diplomatically approach Mexico in hopes of addressing the shortage of agricultural workers. Mexico, still recovering from the 10-year Mexican Revolution, was incentivized towards the program by their poverty-stricken citizens' desperate need for jobs. So on July 23rd of that year, Mexican ambassadors Ernesto Hidalgo and Abraham Navas met with U.S. Representatives Joseph McGurk, John Walker, and David Meeker to start off a long series of diplomatic agreements between the U.S. and Mexico in years to come. And after weeks of negotiation, the first draft of the Bracero program was enacted. Its general provisions included the following. Work-related transportation and other costs would be courtesy of the U.S. government. Mexican workers would not be engaged in any form of military service. Braceros would not face discriminatory acts of any kind. However, throughout the 22 years of the Bracero program's implementation, many aspects were amended. But despite the many renegotiations, it remained far from perfect. The word bracero means one who works with their arms, derived from the Spanish root brazo, meaning arm, and suffix ero, meaning one who works. This generalization of braceros as arms to work with is fitting, as it portrays both the US and Mexico's viewing of them as replaceable tools rather than human workers. This attitude was evident through the treatment they faced. Foremost, braceros could only be purposed for manual labor, meaning they could not drive tractors or operate machinery. This often forced braceros to resort to stoop labor, where workers harvested crops in a hunch or squatting position for hours at a time. As a result, a large number of braceros suffered severe long-term back problems, and later studies found that 1 in 20 braceros experienced major injuries in agriculture. Even while working in these conditions 10 to 12 hours a day, braceros were still cheated out of their already low wages. In the original contract, it was promised that braceros would earn no less than 30 cents an hour, but this rule was often flouted by farmers. Additionally, instead of the promised basic sanitary equipment and housing, braceros were crammed into tight barracks by the dozen, with little privacy.
O calentar el agua para bañarte porque a veces hace un frío en la manzana, hace un frío y barracas ni arregladas están.
But despite this outrageous treatment, there was still incredibly high demand to receive a contract to work in the US. Hopefuls would often move closer to the US-Mexico border for higher chances of being chosen, and bribery of officials was not at all uncommon. But it seemed that all this would end on September 2nd, 1945, when Japan formally surrendered and World War II came to an end. The conclusion of the Second World War saw droves of farm workers returning to their old employment, and a serious debate was raised. would the Bracero program continue? Two sides of the debate emerged. Farm workers returning from war to find their job positions occupied by Mexican laborers hoped to send the Braceros back home. However, employers, who had enjoyed the availability of cheap labor, argued that Braceros were still necessary. They pointed out how, with the effects of post-war urban expansion, people had become reliant on supermarkets and shopping malls to support their everyday life. With independent living diminished, businesses needed Braceros to supply resources for the sudden influx of customers. This latter argument overpowered the former by so much that it was eventually decided the Bracero program would be extended to the end of 1946. In the years that the Bracero program continued to exist, the number of Mexican entrants increased exponentially, leaping from an estimated 44,000 Braceros arriving in 1945 to nearly 450,000 in 1956. For a while, it seemed that the diplomacy between America and Mexico had ended up being a huge success. But unbeknownst to many, with the growing flood of legal Mexican immigrants came a torrent of illegal ones as well. Illegal immigration was a drastic byproduct of the Bracero program and was extremely difficult for the US government to stifle. It was estimated that roughly 4 out of 10 migrant farm workers in the year 1949 were illegal immigrants. To address this, Operation Wetback ensued in 1953. The term wetback, to refer to illegal Mexican immigrants, referenced the common practice of wading across the Rio Grande River to sneak into America. Wetbacks were gladly hired by employers because their illegal presence in the country ensured that they had no rights and could easily be threatened into performance in fear of deportation. During the operation, illegal immigrants were rounded up onto buses, trains, boats, and planes to be sent back to various unfamiliar parts of Mexico. After a single year, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service announced that 1.1 million illegal immigrants had been removed by the operation, making it the largest mass deportation in United States history. With the negative effects piling on and the set termination date approaching, Congress once again had to decide between extending the Bracero program or allowing it to end. But on September 17, 1963, an event happened that heightened the debate further than ever before, and had the potential to bring down the Bracero program once and for all. At a railroad crossing outside Cholula, California, a freight train crashed into a makeshift bus containing 58 migrant farm workers and immediately killed 28 Braceros. The event hit the news as the worst bus tragedy in U.S. history and became a rallying cause for upcoming civil rights movements. A major reason as to why the crash became the face of debate for Bracero's justice was that only 12 of the total 32 bodies were initially identified, as workers were traditionally distinguished by numbers rather than names. The crash also spotlighted the fact that the U.S. government had been categorizing farm workers as vehicle loads, alongside metal, wood, and hay. This dehumanization was emphasized by civil rights activists, sparking debate surrounding the long-ignored mistreatment Braceros had faced. An audience of 9,000 ended up attending the funeral of the 32 victims of the crash, and strikes on food produce sprung up all around America, sending a clear message to Congress. The Bracero program had to end. Despite the protests of employers arguing that the agricultural industry would again plummet without the help of Braceros, the program's closure was already long overdue, and public outrage too great. So in May of 1963, Congress announced that the Bracero program would be terminated by the end of the next year. Although Braceros did not completely disappear when the program ended, their presence slowly faded within the following year, the vast majority having returned to Mexico and reunited with their families. America's dependence on them did not fade so easily, however, as the country had developed a reliance on foreign labor that would prove difficult to eradicate. Mexican workers had been willing to perform labor that domestic workers refused to, and without them, many tedious tasks remained incomplete. Even as of 2022, programs like the H-2A exist to satisfy this dependency, constantly being improved and reformed by debate surrounding their ethics and by past mistakes. The diplomacy between America and Mexico in a time of crisis laid the foundation for foreign worker agreements today, and the millions of Mexican men who labored under ridiculous circumstances while saving a crashing industry will not be forgotten for years to come.